Good morning and welcome to Live with Lewis for September 30th, 2004. We're broadcasting to you today once again live from the National Park Service's Core 2 exhibit, The Tent of Many Voices. And we're proud to be here this morning in Pierre, South Dakota, just a few hundred yards from the mouth of the Bad River, or as Lewis and Clark knew it, the Teton or the Teton River, when they encountered the Teton Sioux 200 years ago from this very week. And we're going to be talking about that and many other things today. Once again, welcome to Live with Lewis for the 30th of September 2004. And we'll get a little bit of just business out of the way. We want to welcome our internet viewing audience today, as well as those of you who will be watching this in archive version later. But for those of you who are joining us today live, we encourage you to send your email questions and comments to Lewis and Clark. That's LEWISANDCLARK. Lewis and Clark, all spelled out, at Clayton, CLAYTON.K12.mo.us. Lewis and Clark at Clayton.K12.mo.us. And we welcome all the students and teachers who are joining us via the internet, via the Apple Learning Interchange today, as well as all of our regular viewers who join us each week as we move across the country. As always, we'll start today's broadcast by talking about what happened to the original Corps of Discovery 200 years ago, and then after we take a look at that historical perspective, we'll start looking at what happened to the Discovery Expedition as we have continued our journey up the river 200 years later and moved past those very same places that the original Corps did. First of all, this is probably one of the most noteworthy weeks with regard to the expedition and their experiences 200 years ago. As we've made our way across the river, we've talked about the changing face of the countryside. We've talked about the increased flora and fauna, the new animal and plants, and even the mineral presences, that the mineral formations and rock formations, geology of the area that had caught Lewis and Clark's eye. Of course, there had been many native tribes by this time that they had already begun to interact with, but perhaps what's most significant about this past week, historically, was the meeting with the Teton Sioux at the mouth of the Teton, or Bad River, where we're located today. And one of the things we want to talk about is that historical moment, and we're going to talk about it both from a historical perspective and the way that the Lewis and Clark expedition viewed it when they had that experience 200 years ago. And we're also going to talk about the experience that we've had 200 years later and maybe expand our perception and understanding of what happened there. For nearly 200 years, and in fact I guess we're right at 200 years now, that experience, that encounter with the Sioux here at this location near present-day Pierre, South Dakota, had been characterized by non-native tribes or non-native persons as the confrontation or standoff with the Sioux at the mouth of the Bad River. Excuse me. One of the things that we're going to have to talk about today is the fact that really that perception is a non-native perception. It is a non-Sioux perception. 3 years ago, when we were actually training for this mission, we had the great experience of being here and actually participating in a pageant with many members of the Ogallala Sioux Nation, Sioux tribe, who were here from Pine Ridge. And one of the things that was impressed upon us was the fact that from a native perspective, that very same encounter was known as the Great Misunderstanding. And communication continues to be one of the paramount issues that human beings have to deal with as they encounter one another and meet with new cultures. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. 200 years ago, Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, and the Corps of Discovery were making their way up the Missouri River, and they had been told by Thomas Jefferson, and had gained a lot of information from traders who had been through this area, that they were probably going to meet with members of the Sioux Nation. Now, remember that they had already met with the Yankton, or the Yankton Sioux, further downstream near current Yankton, South Dakota. But they knew that there were some Sioux that they would meet with that might not be as hospitable as the Yankton had been. And they came here sort of filled with apprehension and sort of anticipating a problem. And, people will often say that you get what if you expect trouble, you're going to get it. And in many ways, that's exactly what happened. Are we okay on our audio now, Jim? I'm getting a lot of feedback. Okay. And so that's kind of what happened really here 200 years ago. They reached this area, and when they were first contacted by young men of the Teton Sioux tribe, they sort of had their hackles up a little bit. They were anticipating some sort of a problem, and so the entire approach from the very outset was probably a little bit forced and tense. And the history records that some young men came to the boat and swam out to the boat at the mouth of the Bad River, just actually downstream somewhat from it. And they had come out of curiosity to see what these men were about. Undoubtedly, many of the tribes along the way, their first impression was that this was a group of traders making their way up the river. Of course, Lewis and Clark wanted to impress upon all of these folks along the way that they were not simply traders, but they were emissaries of the United States. So when these young men came out, they gave them carrots of tobacco, and they asked them to come back to go back to their tribes, to speak with their chiefs and indicate that they would like to have a meeting with the chiefs of the tribe. And those young men did so, and the subsequent days involved an ongoing meeting, encounter, contact with members of the Teteton Sioux tribe. And when they reached the mouth of the Bad River, and we're going to show you some footage of our expedition as well, but when they reached the mouth of the Bad River, rather than actually bringing the keelboat in, as they would do many places, they left the keelboat anchored out in the river because they anticipated a problem, and they ferried both members of the expedition as well as headmen and representatives of the tribe back and forth between the keelboat and the shoreline on the two pirogues. It was on one of those occasions that, and some of you may be aware of this incident, where several of the headmen were returned to the shoreline, and when they were put ashore, they took one of the young men, one of the soldiers, as it were, a brave of the tribe, held onto the cable or the rope that was the bow line for the pirogue, the white pirogue, and would not release that bow line. And there was a very tense moment. William Clark drew his sword. Captain Lewis, on board the keelboat, saw a problem, not fully understanding what was going on, but seeing Captain Clark draw his sword, immediately brought the men on board the keelboat in the red pirogue to the ready arms, so that they were primed, loaded, their weapons were in a firing position, and at the same time, the Sioux warriors on shore, and there were many of them, far outnumbering the Corps of Discovery, also strung their bows and drew their arrows. So it was, without question, the most tense moment in the expedition with regard to hostilities, and it's a moment not to be taken lightly, either then or now, as we consider it and reflect on that moment and what actually happened. One of the things that was the charge of Lewis as he made his way up the river was to establish diplomatic relations with the tribal governments along the way. Part of doing so included presenting the chiefs of those tribes with the medals, flags, and what were called the paroles, or the documents that recognize those individuals as the official leaders of those tribes, and actually were part of a combination of items that were necessary for those individuals to make their way back to St. Louis and ultimately to Washington, D.C. to meet with the President of the United States. Because of them anticipating a problem with the Teteton Sioux here, they were in a hurry. And it was probably partly that hurry that compounded the problem. They were in a hurry to recognize the tribal leadership and move on. One of the problems was they didn't clearly identify who the true leadership of the tribe was. Moreover, Dorian, who was the French trader who had spent a great deal of time among the Sioux, particularly among the Yanktawan Sioux, further south from here, had stayed with the Yanktawan Sioux when they had moved up here. And so the only interpreter that they had with them that had any knowledge of Dakota, or the Siouan language that was spoken in this area, was Cruzat, and Cruzat was not proficient in that language really, and that added to the confusion as well. So what you have here was haste and a group of men who are operating out of fear and anxiety. You have their determination to move on quickly and not actually really maybe identify the true leadership of the group of individuals that they were speaking with. And that's all compounded then again by the fact that they have an interpreter who's not really qualified to do the job. So what happens is they come on shore, and when they identify the buffalo medicine, black buffalo, and the partisan, who were the three headmen that they encountered here, they actually identified those men and believed that those men were the chiefs of the tribe, when in fact they were headmen. They were leaders of the tribe, but they weren't necessarily the final word with regard to how the tribe was going to behave as these men went through. The members of the tribe wanted to have a dialogue. This was a fully actualized society with democratic processes and healthy debate and dialogue among its membership. And there was a great desire among the native people here to discuss how they should proceed with regard to this foreign military presence coming into their backyard and wanting to move through. Keep in mind that Meriwether Lewis had been forced to stop the expedition at Wood River, Illinois, and remain on the eastern side of the river down near St. Louis because the Spanish had not concurred initially with the expedition moving through there. So this was not necessarily an unheard of scenario. And it's important again to remember that aside from the United States, the Sioux Empire was the greatest power on the North American continent in 1804. Aside from the United States, the Sioux had, without question, the strongest military presence in North America, far eclipsing even the ability of the Spanish, who were unable to even mount the successful expedition to intercept the Lewis and Clark expedition. So again, we have to understand the context in which this is all happening. Lewis and Clark are eager to move by. There's confusion about the message that they're trying to convey to the native population that they're encountering here, and the tribe here is anxious to discuss and make a determination themselves as to whether or not they want to allow this group of individuals to go by. Today is the 30th, and essentially, while today marks our last day here in Pierre, it also marks essentially the culminating day with regard to their interaction with the Tetetuan Sioux. And finally, on this day, 200 years ago, the Sioux chief who had been brought on board Black Buffalo is actually put ashore, and he assures the expedition that they will no longer encounter any members of his tribe and wishes them well, essentially, and assures them that they will not have any more problems as they move along the way. We're going to now take a look at our experiences over the last week or so, and you may remember that last week we came to you from Lower Brule with the Lower Brule Sioux, who are actually, many of those folks down there look to what happened here 200 years ago as part of their own tradition. And we were very pleased to spend time with them. But when we came to you last, it was from Lower Brule. The boats were moving around the Big Bend, and we're going to go to the footage now of the last week and talk a little bit about our move on up into Pierre. Here you see, this is a shot from high above a hill overlooking Fort Pierre, and where we are on the west side of the river. Pierre is on the east side, Fort Pierre on the west side. And here you see a marker on top of a very high hill overlooking Fort Pierre. You see the date there, March 30th, 1743. And this tablet was put here by the Vendry, I believe that's correct pronunciation? Verendry, who put this here. And there you see an actual tablet, 1743, when this lead tablet was placed at the top of that hill, overlooking the Missouri River. And here you see the keel boat making its way up after we went around the Big Bend, spent the night at Joe's Creek. And here the keel boat is making its way up on, that's Bad Humor Island in the background, and now making its way into the mouth of the Bad River. There you see the sandbar at the mouth of the Bad River. Lewis and Clark record there being a sandbar at the mouth of the Bad River where they anchored 200 years ago. The White Pirogue was sent in to make contact, and the same is true today as the White Pirogue went into the Bad River. And there you see the keel boat anchored out at the sandbar at the mouth of the river, and that's where it remained over the last several days as we were here for the Bad River Gathering event here at Fort Pierre, South Dakota. And there you see our camp set up in Lily Park, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Lily Park. It is a tremendous space that Fort Pierre has developed, quite nice now.
In their camp.
And here's part of the reenactment.
Up that way, there is a lot of lodges, and further up, there is more yet, he says.
And that a reenactment of the first encounter between Lewis and some of the young men of the Tetetuan tribe. And here you see us participating in a pageant, as we did 3 years ago. That pageant there was, if we can get you to pause there just a minute maybe, Jim. That pageant was part of the ongoing events here over the weekend, commemorating those events 200 years ago, and we'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit later today about those things. We'll continue now. One of the things that's been taking place over the last several weeks, we've been having some protesters, and these folks here are the descendants of Crazy Horse. They're from Pine Ridge, South Dakota. The Pine Ridge Reservation, and many of these individuals feel very strongly about the role of Lewis and Clark as the precursor to the very negative treatment that Native Americans have suffered at the hands of the federal government over the last 150 to 200 years, and again demonstrating their right to free speech. And we have been very supportive of their efforts to come out. They have conducted themselves in a very civil manner and continue to hold nonviolent and very educationally based protests, and will probably be doing so as we continue up the river. And we applaud those folks for exercising their rights of free speech to bring issues of Native American concern to the forefront in the American mind. And if you have not read about the Fort Laramie treaties of 1851 and 1868, we encourage you to do so. Those two treaties and the enforcement or breach of those treaties has been a cause for tremendous concern among Native Americans, particularly the Dakota Sioux who live west of the Missouri River in South Dakota. So there you see those folks, and they've been here with us a few times. We can go back to that footage now, Jim. And we this week, after we participated in the Bad River Gathering, we moved up to the Triple U Buffalo Ranch, where Dances with Wolves was filmed. We spent some time there 3 years ago. Dave Hansen was our guest a couple of weeks ago, talking about buffalo or bison and its role historically, as well as buffalo ranching today. And here you see the buffalo moving across the Triple U. This is the second largest buffalo or bison ranch in the country, about 3,000 head here. And we were out there this week. We actually took a bison this week with flintlock weapons. That meat was dressed out, and we will be actually using that to augment our meals to feed the crew as we move on up the river. And it was quite an event for us to participate in. These animals are actually raised for food and are extremely lean and healthy. Frankie Bechtold was driving the excursion, had a little trouble getting through one of the buffalo wallows the other day, and so we gave him a little assistance there. And there you see a couple of members of the expedition posing, as they are wont to do, in front of Fort Sedgwick, which is a styrofoam reconstruction of a frontier post. It was used in Dances with Wolves. And after we portaged Oahe Dam above Pierre, which is one of the largest dams, certainly the largest of the dams here in South Dakota. It's quite a huge body of water above Pierre, above Oahe Dam. And we portaged the dam over the last few days, brought all the boats around, and here you'll see all three of the boats, the keel boat, the white pirogue, and the red pirogue, now entering Lake Oahe and making their way on up. And currently we've made our way up to Pike Haven last night, and are now moving up to Sutton Bay today, and I'll be joining the folks back at the boats there this afternoon after our broadcast. So that gives you a little bit of an idea about what we've been up to. It has been a tremendous week for us. Not only have we hopefully been successful in continuing to educate people about the particulars and details of the original expedition, but it's also been an eye-opening and educational week for us as we have had the opportunity to lend an ear to those issues, very current issues of great interest and importance to members of the Native American community here in South Dakota. And so it's been a satisfying week, and one that we will undoubtedly look back on fondly, and hopefully it's been a period of growth for members of our organization, many of whom this is their first experience in South Dakota and their first experience with regard to Native American issues, both historical and current. So we applaud the efforts, as I mentioned before, of those Native Americans who are struggling to bring their issues to the forefront, and many of those websites will be available to link to through ours, and we encourage you to read more about the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 and 1868. If you're not familiar with those, I would refer you to the internet and encourage you to read those. They are online, available at a number of websites, and probably after reading them, you may understand why there has been such an outcry from the Native American community about having some grievances addressed. So we encourage you to do that. Teachers and students particularly should take this opportunity, as we have talked about for many months, to lend an ear to Native American issues and to gain a greater understanding of the Native American perspective on particularly treaties and other issues of very current import to them. Right now we're going to be joined by Dave Reichtag, who is with the Fort Pierre, South Dakota Development Corporation. Is that the correct?
That's right, Scott.
And you are the executive director?
That's right.
Day has been instrumental in the Bad River Gathering. She's been our host here over the last week or so, and has probably breathed a great sigh of relief because a lot of the planning and organizing over the last several years, I guess, really, has come to fruition, come to culmination here this past week, and it's sort of behind you. I think that probably now, I'm sure you all have a lot to do yet, but at least this milestone has passed. So thank you for joining us, Day.
Thank you, Scott. It's been great fun to have you here, and while there may be a little relief, I think all of us who have been involved are going to be really sorry to see you go and the Park Service pull out. It's been a really exciting time for all of us.
Well, we didn't quite all of us probably double the population of Fort Pierre, but we probably impacted it greatly. How many people live in Fort Pierre?
You probably came pretty close. Fort Pierre has about 2,300 people in population, and it was...
Not counting the flies.
Well, if you add them, that's about 15 million at least. We've known for several years, as you said, that we would probably have a lot of visitors this week, people who are following the Lewis and Clark Trail, because we happen to have the mouth of the Bad River in our town. And Fort Pierre has a lot of history in its own right. This is the oldest white town or continuously occupied town in the state. And as you mentioned, the Verendrye Plate was found here, which actually anchored France's claim to the entire area, which later became the Louisiana Purchase. So there's a lot going on here, but we knew that there'd be a lot of attention on the Lewis and Clark site. And we've had a lot of visitors, and it's been a great thing to be part of.
Excellent. Well, there certainly has been a lot of work done. One of the things that I mentioned to you earlier, and I've spoken to other folks about, is that we established our camp in Lily Park. Now, 3 years ago when we were here, Lily Park looked very different than it does now. And one of the things that's happened all across the country, really, all the way from the East Coast to here, and quite a bit along the Missouri River, has been redevelopment of the riverfront, and largely spurred by the activities associated with the Bicentennial. Tell us a little bit about what's happened to Lily Park.
Yeah, you're right. It's been a great chance for us to do some sprucing up that we really needed to do and wanted to do. Lily Park 3 years ago was about a third the size that it is now. We had some pretty unsightly areas around it. I'm looking over here because the park is right outside the tent. And the waterfront was rough. Over 3 years, and partially with some funding from the National Park Service, which we want to acknowledge and say that we're grateful for, we've been able to buy out some of the mobile home courts and areas around the park, so it's, like I said, about 3 times as big as it was. We have also used those Park Service funds and some National Park Service interpreters to bring in some signage that describe what happened here and why it's significant still today. Planted some native grasses. We basically have fixed the park up, and to the point where just a little bit earlier this summer, the National Park Service certified Lily Park as an official site on the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail.
Well, very good.
I'm proud of that.
And we want to brag on Fort Pierre because that's where we are, and we've always been very much at home here. But you're right across the river from Pierre, South Dakota, which is only about 16,000 people, I think.
16 would be all the population of both towns and both counties. I think Pierre itself. Pierre is the smallest state capital in the United States.
Well, no, I heard that. My wife argued that. She's from Vermont, and she thinks that Montpelier might be. I don't know. I know, but it's right down there. The two of them are probably contending.
I think you're right. I think that what they say is that if you combine Pierre and Fort Pierre and then Montpelier and their sister city, we're smaller. But we're one of the two smallest. Anyway.
It is a small place, but it has a beautiful Capitol building, absolutely spectacular. And for the state, that state capitol's here. And so really, even though there are two different communities, it feels like one when you're here. And recreation-wise, this area is terrific for recreation. The water here, and it's going to be difficult for you to see it probably. You saw some footage of us moving there earlier. The water here is emerald green. It is beautiful, beautiful water, and for people who are interested in water recreation, whether that be boating or fishing or whatever, certainly a destination for that.
We think it's a great place to come. It is absolutely clean water and clean air here. It's world-class walleye fishery, pheasant hunting, goose hunting. We have a lot of people come in for for those purposes. And those of us who live here think it's a pretty wonderful place to bring up our families.
Okay, very good. Now we're gonna focus a little bit on why we were here this week. It was the Bad River Gathering, and let's talk a little bit about the Bad River Gathering. And very quickly, we know it took you a while to get it going, and tell us a little bit about that. But then tell us a little bit about basically what took place here over the last few days.
Sure. And again, going back 4 or 5 years ago, when we began to realize that we would expect a high visitation here because of Lewis and Clark, we knew that we wanted to have something here in the community going on when people came in to commemorate this important event. And it did take us 2 or 3 years to put together the committee of volunteers who made Bad River Gathering happen. And we waited until we had the right co-chair people, and you're going to be speaking with one of the 2 co-chairs again in a minute here. But several of us felt that it was important, at least partially because of what took place here, the meeting with the, we say, Dakota Nation, that it was important to focus on the perspective of events that happened here from the point of view of the people who were living here, and not just the intrepid explorers and the adventurers who were coming through. So with Bad River Gathering, we really made an effort to reach out. We worked with the Lakota Heritage Society from the Pine Ridge Reservation, and basically we said, look, there's going to be a lot of people coming here. We will create the platform. You will have an audience. We want you to tell the story from your point of view. And the Fort Pierre group had nothing to say with how that encounter was portrayed. This was a perspective that was created by the Lakota people themselves. And so we had 3 versions of the pageant, which the Discovery Expedition and your crew also took place in, and it was marvelous. We also had artists and craftspeople, really from around several states here. There was a lot going on this weekend.
Well, let's take a look at some of what went on this past weekend, and why don't you speak to it while we take a look at it?
Okay, this is some of the demonstrators who were here in Lily Park. The mouth of the Bad River, there was a city park here even before we began the fish up, and it's called now Fisher's Lily Park. These are some of the demonstrators who were in the park. We had a number of artists and dance groups and performers and so on going on. I believe we'll be coming around here to where the tents of the Discovery Expedition were set up. Oh, we're over in Pierre now. This is the Goose Fest performance at Steamboat Park there.
And this is part of the pageant?
We can just listen to each other without prejudice. We can just try to understand the deeds and thoughts of the other. We can work to understand not just the words spoken out, but the hearts that underlie them. We can grow stronger together. This is the inspiration our past can give us. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
The South Dakota Discovery Center is a hands-on science museum in Pierre, and we had a number of school kids in for a Lewis and Clark Day. And this is our Pierre State Capitol. As you said, it's a very beautiful building. It's designed by the same architect who designed the Pennsylvania Capitol in Philadelphia, and the grounds on the Capitol have received a number of national awards. So we're real proud of it in our small community here. And there is a geothermal hot springs at the lake by the Capitol, which you just saw, and this is the flaming fountain, we call it, the eternal memorial for our people who have served their country and lost their lives.
Very good. And just, again, focusing on Fort Pierre, there are just a couple of other things that are just of interest here. You've got the old jail up here. What's the story on that jail? That's always intrigued me.
There's so many parts to our history, and we know that a lot of the people who come to Fort Pierre really are historic buffs. The old jail, which is right on the main highway through town, is in place where it was when it was built, right at the turn of the century. 1902 is when the jail was built. And it's in the same spot and has the same dirt floor and the same cells. And
any famous tenants there?
Not that I could tell you, no, but for a smile, we'll get the key and open it up and let you go in there and see what it was like to be in there. Fort Pierre was the trailhead on this side of the Fort Pierre Deadwood trail. When the gold rush kicked off in the Black Hills, of course there was ferry service to Fort Pierre to cross the Missouri River, and then from here is where the gold hunters and all the associated people took off to get to the Black Hills. So it was quite a jump in town around that time.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Day. I appreciate you being here today. And on behalf of the Discovery Expedition, we thank you so much for your hospitality and your concern for our stay here. Yesterday, you had the chance of seeing the boats from up near where you live, up at Peoria Flats, and you said that was a nice view. So I hope that's a lasting memory for you. And we want to thank you for the tomatoes that you brought us today as well. So thanks.
And the chocolate chip cookies, don't forget.
And the chocolate chip cookies. Thank you so much, Day.
It's been wonderful having you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. And we do want to encourage our audience members and folks that are traveling the trail or have a chance to get up in this area to stop by Pierre, stop by Fort Pierre. It's a very inviting and hospitable community here, and you'll certainly enjoy your stay. We're going to be joined next by Clarence Mortensen, and if we could ask Clarence to go ahead and join us up here. And we're going to talk with Clarence a little bit about an ongoing project that's taking place here in this area. As we've mentioned, 200 years ago, this was the place where essentially the culture of the United States, the young United States, made its first contact with the people who lived here, the indigenous population, whether they be referred to as the Tetuan band of the Sioux or the Lakota as the larger body. This culture and this first contact between these two cultures taking place here was a momentous one. And one of the things that when we talk about what happened historically 200 years ago, this is a very important thing to understand, is that Lewis and Clark were anticipating a problem. They were anticipating a problem because of stories that they had heard about this mighty empire of the Sioux that controlled this river. Jefferson had spoken to them and had actually written a letter January 22nd of 1804 to Lewis, impressing upon him the need to develop very positive and friendly relations with these people because not only of their tremendous influence, but because of what Jefferson believed the ultimate disposition of those people to enter into a commercial relationship with the United States. When they arrived here and those tense moments took place where guns were drawn and arrows were slung, were pulled in the bowstrings, it was the maturity of a man there at the scene, an older man at the scene, that diffused that situation. It was the maturity of an older man who saw that nothing good was going to come out of that potentially violent encounter. It just so happens that the man who diffused that situation was a Lakota headman. He was an elderly Lakota, an elderly Native man who saw through the eyes of age and wisdom that what was going to take place there would ultimately be bad for all parties interested. And that brings us to our guest today, Mr. Clarence Mortensen, and I appreciate you being here today. Thank you so much, sir, and we welcome you, and we're eager to hear about the Willacota Center that's going to be that's going to be built here. First of all, again, welcome, and if you could please tell us a little bit about what brings you here and the Wakwasicha Center that we're going to be talking about.
Well, the concept was a joint idea between a group of whites and Indian people who had felt that the history of this area had been told by the victors, which happens in so many cases, and that there was another side to the question. When I went to grade school, the Indians in our history books in South Dakota were portrayed as murderous, thieving savages who had nothing in their culture that was worthwhile to preserve, and that it was a part of the concept of manifest destiny, which arrived here with the Pilgrims in early days and had grown and grown as the country expanded. And so we thought we'd tell it from the Indian side. And in digging back into the history, the Verendrais, when they visit here, only 3 people buried that lead plate, had traveled among the Indians for almost a year. And in their notes, there's nothing but praise for the way that they were treated by the Indian people, how well that they were treated, how the Indians never molested what little trade goods they were ever had with them. And a good share of their notes, in fact, I noticed, was occupied with the idea of how well they had been treated by the various tribes they moved through. And so we thought it was worthwhile to tell that from the Indian side. The first ethnologist, or person that was recognized as a possible ethnologist, was Catlin when he came up here in 1831. His creed said nothing but good things about the Indians, and it cost him dearly. Congress refused to buy his paintings, and a great many of them were destroyed when the warehouse in Philadelphia burned up. And he was roundly castigated because what he said was diametrically opposed to what the manifest destiny the people believed at that time. You notice now in the history programs that on the History Channel, some of them, they're starting to reinterpret some of that history from the Indian side. And it's different. The Custer battlefield story, you wouldn't know they were talking about the same thing happening. And that's what we hope to, for both societies, the white society and the Indian people, to bring them together to benefit the Indian people economically, to teach them respect, so that our young people don't commit suicide and have such a hard time becoming a part of our whole society.
And that's particularly important here in South Dakota, it would seem. I mean, you know, much of our audience lives east of the Mississippi River. A lot of the people who are probably viewing this today and will watch this piece of footage are folks who live east of the Mississippi River and don't necessarily have to deal on a daily basis or even be aware on a daily basis of issues facing Native Americans and facing natives and non-natives living together in such close proximity as they do here in South Dakota. For a South Dakotan, when we talk about these issues of reconciliation and bringing the cultures together, this is really a daily issue here and a very immediate issue, isn't it, for you all?
Yes, it is. And South Dakota, you know, we have several of the poorest counties in the United States down on the Pine Ridge Reservation and throughout the other reservations. A part of the Waukesha project will be, by direction of Congress, the establishment of an appellate court here. They're calling it a Supreme Court, that will bring the Indian courts in compliance with the Uniform Commercial Code, so that they will have that, and Indians will be able to then benefit from the Community Reinvestment Act and those things that are in our laws that are supposed to protect people's lending rights, which are not enforced on these reservation areas today. So from an economic standpoint, when this is completed, it'll be one of the greatest things that ever happened in South Dakota. It'll bring up people today who have 60–70% unemployment up to an area where they're equals within the whole state and have a tremendous benefit for South Dakota.
And while that benefit is statewide, being centered right here in Pierre is very important, obviously the state capital, but there's even something more interesting and significant, even if just as a emblematic of the direction that this is leading. The center itself, and maybe we can spend a little bit of time talking about the physical center itself. It's located on 12 acres of land that could tell us about the land itself, where it's located. I think that's significant for our audience to understand.
The land is about 1.5 miles north of Highway 14 on the north edge of Fort Pierre. The land was county land, but it was probably the very ground that Lewis and Clark, where the Indians were camped and where they danced for Lewis and Clark.
Right, and let me just interject, excuse me, Clark. I do want to interject because I failed to mention this earlier. We talk about the encounter at the mouth of the Bad River and this standoff on the 25th of September. But everyone often fails to remember that on the 26th and the 27th that they feasted together for the following 2 days.
That's right. The Indians carried Lewis and Clark on buffalo hides from the ships as a sign of respect. And so the whole encounter ended very well for them. But, you know, when we go back and look at that, and you covered it earlier, it wasn't the almost disastrous end of an expedition. It was just misunderstanding. The Indians were not savage, mean in there. They weren't looking for trouble. Right. And so it ended very peacefully. The site is adjacent to where the Fort Pierre Chateau was established later, which was a consequence of the opening up of the fur trade here that Lewis and Clark had set in place, although there had been some traders up here, but Lewis and Clark expedition was the one that really opened the Missouri River. It's interesting to note the site up there, we have the 7 teepees up there that represent the 7 council fires. Now there's a lot of misinterpretation on that. Some think that designates the 7 bands of the Teton Sioux. But it wasn't. It was the 7 council fires of the original Sioux Nation. Yes, which is well described in Lewis and Clark's notes. Now, Lewis and Clark, we know, didn't get to the Mississippi River, nor did they travel very far from the Missouri River. So we know that what they took in their notes, they got from the Chateau family, the American Fur Company in St. Louis. They learned about the Sioux. And even at that time, even the fur traders didn't know much about the Teton Sioux to the west. That was better defined later on. When Congress authorized and designated the Waukesha group to build this project for them, or so supervise it, with Congress appropriating the money, they designated the Waukesha group to see that funneled the money through us to see that this was completed. So the 7 teepees up there representing the 7 council fires go back to the original Sioux people, tribes. And Lewis and Clark defined them pretty well and got the names. They were off in their spelling a little bit, but then when they were trying to spell some names that they'd heard from people with a guttural language, that's understandable. Lieutenant Warren, G.K. Warren, who came through here in 1855, you read his notes, pretty much matches Lewis and Clark's, except by that time a lot more was known about the Teton.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the 12 acres, though. If it's not, tell us that there's something special about those 12 acres.
Yes, sir. When Congress wrote the act, I believe it was Senator Inouye who said he wanted the land put in trust for the Great Sioux Nation. Nobody had ever defined the Great Sioux Nation, when we got copies of the original legislation, we said this has got to be changed a little bit here. Let's define it, and so it is defined in the act, the Great Sioux Nation. It doesn't follow the names in there follow the reservations that were set up in later years. And so we're still in the process of sorting out who lives on those reservations that might belong to the Nakotas, which are the Yanktons and the Yanktonais, or the Dakotas, which were the Sioux that lived on the Mississippi River and in Minnesota until the Great Sioux Uprising at the time of the Civil War. And then, of course, the Tetons. That's pretty much the western group, western.
But those 12 acres, am I correct, those are the first 12 acres that have been essentially put back in trust or transferred essentially in some way back to the Sioux Nation since the Fort Laramie treaties, is that correct?
Yes, sir, and it sets a precedent. We've still got lawyers studying this to find out what it means, because Congress forgot to define just exactly what it means and how it's to be accomplished. But we had a meeting this week, and I think we're going to get it worked out.
Yes,
that is the first time that land has been put back into trust that anybody can remember. I mean, it's a historical first.
Now, when the center is completed, there's going to be a lot of different components to it, both real functional aspects with regard to economic development. The Sioux Supreme Court will be there, the judicial aspect of it, and you're working real closely, I know, with University of North Dakota and University of South Dakota on some of the legal library stuff and all the educational resources that will be there. But also it's going to be a cultural center as well, a place of gatherings, events. Tell us just a little bit of an overview of the whole place.
Well, you've covered, the judicial and the grounds. There will be a prairie restoration on there with with all of the plants, and many of them are on the endangered species list now. All of the plants that the Indians used for food and medicine and in their religious ceremonies. There will be an interpretive center, and some of the aspects of that are there will be a genealogical center. We will obtain records from the Examiner of Inheritance's office, because the Indians, there were no counties or states, and those early probates were handled through what is known as the Examiner of Inheritance. After the treaties were signed, the government promised schools out here for the Indians. They reneged on their promises, and ultimately the schools that were started in this area for the Indians were handed out to three religious groups: the Catholics, the Episcopalians, and the Congregational Church. And so you found areas of the reservation where they set up a school, and in that area everybody was Catholic. And in another area where the Episcopalians set up a school and had influence, everyone, as they converted to Christianity, were Episcopalians, and the Congregationals. Those records, for instance, with the Catholics, were first kept we were under the Archdiocese of St. Louis. And then as civilization spread, there was Omaha and eventually Sioux Falls for South Dakota. The Episcopalians, the first missionaries out here, came from Faribault, Minnesota. And so those records are back there: marriage, birth, death, whatever. And the Congregationals, the Yankton College down here, was the repository for those. So we're going to gather those together. So as some Indian is doing genealogical research, we will have one concentrated place here to go. We will have a film and a film library and a regular library there containing all of the history books and documentaries that have been filmed over the years that affect and teach the Indian culture from a historical standpoint. There will be exhibits in there. We're not going to have a museum. We have a wonderful museum here in Pierre, and we're very proud of it, and that interprets that part of it. We will be a living interpretive center.
It's about the future.
Yes, sir. It's we've been there, done that. We're looking to the future and to building a better life for the Indian people and integrating them into our society.
And a better life ultimately for all of us as who have to share this land and be stewards of it. And so we thank you so much for the work you're doing. I wish we had a little more time. I'd like to hear about your ranch. I heard some great things about your ranch as well, Mr. Clarence Morganson, and we certainly appreciate you being here with us today. We're going to hopefully have an opportunity to see some footage maybe next week. We'll get a shot of the place of the Lakota Center and the Wakvasich efforts out there. Do we have some questions from email? Do we have no email questions? Do we have any questions from the audience today, either about the original expedition, the Discovery Expedition's efforts right now? And we're going to be continuing on after today's broadcast with a presentation here, so there'll be an opportunity for that. Or any questions today for Mr. Mortensen? Okay, well, in the interest of time right now, I'm going to turn back to Jim. And as Clarence said, it's about the future, and that they're looking to not only remember the past, but to proceed on. And as always, as we tell you, it's time for us until next week to proceed on as well. We'll be coming to you live next week from West Whitlock, up about an hour or so north of Pierre, where we're going to be up there on the river. There's going to be an Earth Lodge we'll be able to show you, an Arikara Earth Lodge, and some other things, and we'll certainly have some more adventures as we move on up the river. Until we see you next time, I'm Scott Mandrell, coming to you from Fort Pierre, South Dakota, with Live with Lewis at the Tent of Many Voices National Park Service Corps 2 exhibit. And until we see you next time, we proceed on.